wanted to thank all of you for your support along the way, for responding to my scheduling requests and getting your teams on board to support in that regard as well. So big thanks to all of you for helping us get to this point and for contributing to the insights that we'll be sharing with you today. Just to talk a little bit about who the team is. So I'm obviously Sarah Garver, been leading the research for this phase 1 of the partnership with DCF. Rachel Heidloff is also on the call. You'll see her more as she is leading the next phase, which is really around taking the insights that we share with you today and translating those into a broad set of engagement activities geared towards supervisors, social workers, and managers sort of across the board. There's a number of deliverables that will come after this. And so these two phases are linked in that way. And then you can see there on the screen the core team and some of the executive support that we've had up until, or as we've gone through this process, meeting weekly to work through the project and make sure things go as smoothly as they can. So to give you a little bit of background on Root, we have varying levels of familiarity with who Root is and what we do. So just wanted to kind of set some context here. Our purpose is there on the left. So we exist to invigorate the power of human beings to make a difference. So we're a change management consulting firm, and we really believe that true change in organizations is most successful when we get people involved, when we can sort of get to that untapped potential people have to not only, we want people to understand the change that's happening, but we also need them to feel bought in, feel motivated, feel engaged in the process as part of the story and part of the journey. And so we have a variety of methods that we use to get people into the change process. On the left there, you see sort of Root's change process. So we work to define the future, build an organizational movement, and then that sustainment piece to create lasting change. The partnership we have going with DCF, we're really in that define your future phase, moving into those latter two phases through a variety of things. So we have those methodologies there. We have learning maps coming, which are large visual dialogue-based experiences that we take individuals through, individuals in groups generally, take them through to understand why the change is occurring, what needs to change, what their role is in the change. It tends to be very, very effective, very engaging ways to instill some of the change mindsets and behaviors that we want to see. We also have a variety. Compass is our manager training program. We use film in a variety of different ways to tell a story, and as well as other methodologies that you'll hear down the line. We are industry agnostic. We do this with large corporate clients. We do this with with NGOs, with nonprofits, with a variety of people. And so it has been it's been a privilege and an honor to partner with DCF on this particular topic and content. So what we set out to do was on the left there to identify the complex decision-making and support structures that are used by local child welfare agencies that have been able to successfully progress toward the Wisconsin Child Welfare Transformation Initiative. So that transformation that we're referring to, the strategy there is, it seeks to dramatically increase the number of children and families served in home. So as you all know, we reached out to you all, to the counties, to understand how can we draw on the expertise and the experiences and the opportunities that is already happening on the ground to start to identify ways to scale this statewide and to sort of support all counties wherever they are in the change journey, support all counties towards system-wide solutions. So today, what we're going to talk about are some of the outcomes that we're driving towards with this research, the kind of change we want to see. We'll walk you through our process, so you'll be familiar, but wanted to give you some deeper context into how we set up the research, how we went about analyzing it. And then we'll spend the majority of the time going through our findings. What are those behaviors that we're trying to scale towards at a state level? And then finally, next steps. So what's sort of the timeline in terms of what comes after this with respect to Roots partnership with DCF? And just to, I'll talk about the outcomes in a second, but I also emailed over a handout to this group. If you were on the calendar invite, emailed a PDF that can be helpful once we get to the findings portion of the presentation today. It has that handout has a place for notes. It has some of the behaviors that you'll see us call out and describe as the findings, and then it has an opportunity for you as leaders to begin to do some of the self-reflecting as to where your county might be with respect to the consistency of a given behavior or a given trait. Obviously, with a county-run system, there's variation, and we actually benefit from that variation in terms of understanding patterns across the state. But it also means that the areas as leaders that are important to focus on will vary depending on who you are, the change that's already happened, sort of areas of opportunity going forward. So just wanted to call that out. You should have received an email about an hour ago with that. And as we get to the findings, that'll also be helpful, hopefully helpful. So with that, when we think about outcomes, these are kind of 6 main areas that we want to think of as areas to drive change and the kind of change we want to see. So at the top there, you see family first agency cultures. In other words, these are agency cultures that from the top down, through consistent messaging, prioritize serving families in home as much as possible. Then we have safety-driven in decision-making. So the approach to assessments towards engaging with families, all is in pursuit of safety, isolating safety threats, really understanding the backstory of families so that we can better understand how to implement sufficient controls while also supporting the family in their change journey. And then finally, change-ready families. So we want to, in the course of our engaging with families, help them come along, help them be motivated and bought in to do the change work within their own family that will be important for the welfare and well-being of children and families. On the agency side, starting from the top, we want to see proactive leaders, so leaders who understand the needs of their people and are working to remove some of those potential barriers that are important and relevant to this work. We want effective teams that can help to collaborate well, can share best practices, can support one another as urgent needs come up. And ultimately, we want supported workers. So workers who feel like they are backed by their next level leaders and backed by the agency culture and the decisions that they're making with respect to the children and families that they serve. So to take you through a little bit of the process for how what happened just before we reached out to you all as counties, and then how we analyzed the data that we gathered from all of you. There were 13 counties that we identified for participation. And we then, we wanted to pay attention to regional variation as well as size in terms of the children served, the out-of-home care population served each year. And from those 13 counties, how did we select those 13? So we start with data. We started with metrics, and we wanted to say, okay, let's situate all the counties on a change continuum to see where we fall and to see what kind of variation there might be. And we needed critical metrics to do that. So first we started with wanting to see decline in the total out-of-home care population served. Between 2015 and 2019 was the set of data that we used. 2 comments on that: we weighted that towards more recent years, given the rollout of the strategic transformation, and that was primarily happening in 2018 and 2019. So we gave a little bit more weight to more recent years. And we also controlled for changes in the number of screened in calls because we didn't want the declines in the total out-of-home care population to be heavily influenced by fluctuation in access calls, particularly screened in access calls. The 2 other related metrics were our entries to exits ratio. We wanted ultimately, we want to see more children exiting rather than entering the system, and then percent removals from screened in calls. So helping to proxy for that front end decision making. We wanted to see a relatively lower percent removals from those screened in calls. So we take those three metrics and we look at both the level in 2019 as well as the trend over those years between 2015 and 2019. And that situates counties along that continuum. And then we further refined our possible list of counties by excluding counties that served fewer than 40 children a year, maintaining that size and region variation with respect to our comparison groups, and then proxying for racial diversity in out-of-home care relative to the population. And then finally drawing on our core team and other content experts to think about the extent to which we might have already engaged a county in the work that we were doing or in related topics. So from that sort of data profile, I've sort of referenced this change continuum. We put the counties on this continuum, and we want to identify counties that are furthest along in that transformation and counties that are on the way. So for the counties that are furthest along as a metrics profile, they had declines in the out-of-home care population between that time period. They had an exits to entries ratio less than 1, and fewer than 10% of screened in calls result in removal. And then we wanted to not only understand those who are furthest along, but understand other points in the change continuum, particularly that group that's on the way, a little bit more in the middle from a data standpoint. So 5 to 10% growth in out-of-home care between those years, entries to exits being low, but not quite below 1, and then 10 to 15% of screened in calls resulting in removal. And that helps us to understand what are some of the behaviors characterizing groups along this continuum of change, so that we can better support the whole system in developing solutions and supports as we go forward with the transformation. All right, so we reached then out to 13 counties. We talked with, as you know, directors, supervisors, and workers. And then we also did virtual observations, so signing on and requesting a lot of meeting invites from you all as with respect to Zoom. And we analyzed a lot of data. So we had over 2,000 minutes of interview data, 1,600 minutes of focus group data, over 2,000 minutes of virtual observation that were transcribed, coded, and then synthesized in the aggregate. As you might remember, we explored a number of areas with respect to where we might find patterns or differentiating behaviors. So we looked at mindsets and alignment related to the shift, how to make the shift, what might already be happening with respect to implementation, what's our ideal approach to working with families, what's our roles and collaboration with those inside and outside of the welfare agency, and then what might be workforce needs and support structures that we're aware of. And those were the main topics at the director level. And then with supervisors and workers, we got a little closer to the practice focus. So still talking about mindsets and approach to working with families, also around how do we really engage people in this change, what would be most compelling, what are common concerns, things like that. We used a case scenario that we developed to better work through that decision making of, when workers are presented with characteristics of a case, how do they think about reasons for or against supporting this family and home? How would they approach next steps in terms of gathering more information? Ultimately, how feasible do they think it would be to serve a family and home based on a set of characteristics put in front of them? And so that really helped us see, using the same scenario, what are different ways that different counties approach that decision-making process. And then finally, the communication and collaboration piece. So that's both with respect to how they work as teams and with leadership, as well as how they think about some of those external stakeholders that influence how a case might play out. So that those are some of the areas that we looked for, and then we take all of that data and we analyze it in the aggregate and to arrive at a set of advanced behaviors. And so what this means from a single county perspective is that a single county might vary in the presence or consistency of a given behavior. We're looking for things at the aggregate. So if you look at that heat map on the right side of your screen, this sort of gives us a visualization of what our data set could look like with respect to identifying these behaviors. So you can see that there's more green than yellow on the left, but there's pockets. So there's pockets of white where maybe within a single county, they did or they didn't speak to a given behavior, or there's no single county that was, green across the board with every behavior. And so this is really where that handout will come in, because we know that with respect to these different sections of behaviors and findings that we'll walk through, it's really going to be an important process of leaders to reflect on how much this describes your own county, and whether there are areas to learn more about or reinforce with your leaders and with your staff. So that kind of takes us through the process and the setup. Like we said, if you have questions along the way, we can use the chat, and then we'll clarify or hold those until we can respond more in full. All right, so as we start to move into the findings themselves, we have three main areas to talk about. So first, we'll start by talking about the mindsets and decision making, from starting at kind of the agency level down to workers and how they're approaching those individual cases that they're working with. Then we'll talk more about the support structures. So first, the external supports, the service array, as well as external stakeholders like the court system or law enforcement, schools, community partners, that kind of thing. And then we'll end by talking about those internal support structures. So how are we functioning as an agency? What are those supervisor and team dynamics that are supporting and enabling workers? And then at the agency level, supporting, serving more families in home. So to start with mindsets and decision making. So the first behavior that we wanted to start out with is that the shift is already happening in culture and decision making in those counties that are further along in this journey. So the agency or the division culture really prioritizes and reinforces the importance of keeping families in home. And so what this looked like was sort of from day one, workers articulating there was a very clear message that serving families in home whenever possible was not just important, but was a priority. Decisions to remove were often met with critical questioning and potentially even pushback if it seemed like there could be more that was done to try and keep children in home through a given plan. There was consistent messaging. So from leadership down to workers, we interviewed or did focus groups across different levels, and the message was consistent in terms of that being a key priority and a key trait defining their local agency. And then workers ultimately cite the agency culture as a key support for doing the work. So when we ask them things like, what has been really beneficial in carrying out this work, or what has been really helpful, articulating that the culture itself is a support in and of itself to be able to do that work. The comparison here is that while across the board, workers wanted to be able to serve families in home and see that as a valuable shift to make, there was just greater skepticism around the how. So the conversation was more quickly to turn to, we really want to be doing this, but we're not really sure how we can do this more. We don't think we have the resources to do this more. That was then the comparison in terms of the advance versus on the way approach. There was that there's a desire, but there's still some uncertainty as to how to get there. So then as we think about the perspective towards the shift for leaders, particularly directors, they articulated things like this is a system level change. And to workers, it was more of this is business as usual. This doesn't really feel like a shift. So workers don't feel like it's a big change. Directors, having recognized the significance of the policy or the strategy, have already been working to implement it. And we actually heard greater concern in our advanced counties at the leadership level relative to the importance of carrying out this shift and sort of activities that had already been underway to make this possible. Things like that were working to reorient the service provider network, messaging with external stakeholders, beginning to think about sort of at a worker level, what are workloads like, how can some of those concerns be alleviated. And then workers were relatively unfazed in many cases. They were sort of like, yep, this is what we do. This is a priority. We spend a lot of time and energy serving families in home. It doesn't really feel new. And then I would say the comparison was more of a little bit more of a delay in implementation. Obviously, the pandemic has put a significant challenge in the way in terms of prioritizing this shift, and also, I would say a higher level of expectation from the state that the state should be communicating guidance, direction, providing resources, sort of a little bit more of a waiting on for what the state might do or not do with respect to the strategic shift. So we're sort of moving from the agency level down, getting closer and closer to the level of workers and the practice of this. So as we think about how did people approach families, what was the ideal family worker relationship in order to serve more families in home? Counties shared similar conceptual goals towards families, but there were sort of two different stances with respect to how they engage with a particular family, excuse me. So all counties described that ideally the relationship is things like honesty, trust, respect, cooperation. But the perspective towards families could differ somewhat. So advanced counties really take a very non-judgmental approach toward the actions of different families, and they're optimistic in the belief that a family can change. So workers keep a really open mind with respect to the family themselves. Leaders reiterate the critical importance of this mindset, sort of believing in your family, being a cheerleader for your family. And there's really no editorializing or judgment of families past. There's only a desire to understand where this family is coming from and what kind of supports or safety controls might be important going forward. And particularly in observation, workers were very careful in their word choice to avoid ever sounding disparaging or pessimistic towards a given family. I think the comparison then is just a little bit more skepticism. So rather than this optimistic view of a family and their ability to change, there was a little bit more of a skepticism as to how the family, whether or not the family might be successful in the long term, talking about more discussion of sort of having to overcome or not being sure how best to overcome negative perceptions of CPS, that those can't always be overcome, that there can be concerns around the quality of information received and the likelihood of long-term success. And so that's sort of the mindset towards the family. And then when we think about actually engaging with that family, workers in advanced counties are more likely to center themselves as change agents with skills to arrive at the desired outcomes. So workers took a lot of ownership over the kind of relationship they have with families, not necessarily whether the family was ultimately successful, but took a lot of ownership over recognizing that family's buy-in, that family's engagement with the process and their willingness to be sort of motivated and bought in could depend a lot on the worker and the approach that the worker took working with a family. And so the two key things that they that they do is to use consistency and follow through to overcome a family's negative perceptions of CPS. So talking about just the critical importance of if you set an expectation, you meet that expectation, even if you think it's something small. They we didn't really hear about being skeptical towards information. Instead, they talked about sort of being comfortable probing or gathering insight, even when they think that information is initially being withheld. It's a very sort of just constant listen and learn approach. There's not much while they communicate, yes, we have a role here, we have a certain level of authority per se. They'd never want to use that authority. That's much more of a coming alongside, seeing families as equals to communicate honestly, transparently, and to help them better understand who the family is and what they might need going forward. What's their backstory? How do they really understand the situation? In comparison, so rather than the worker seeing themselves really as the owner of that kind of relationship and the driver of that relationship, the comparison is that there was more expectation or more onus on the family themselves to sort of buy in. So there would be, we're gonna communicate in a straightforward way. We're gonna communicate what the process is, but then it's really up to the family to determine whether or not they're going to come along. So we can support the family, but the family is the expert in the sense that we're waiting for them to hear what is their plan, what is their intention, what do they need from us. So more of a supportive role rather than a role that really sort of came alongside or tried to drive what that relationship could look like. So to better understand the decision-making itself, supervisors and workers discussed a case study that modeled an initial assessment. So it was a brief version of what an initial assessment would be. We worked with the Bureau of Performance Management to create these case studies or these initial assessments, and they involved multiple complex factors. So there was substance abuse, there was physical discipline or abuse, concerns of physical discipline or abuse, there were mental health concerns. In one of the two case studies, there was actually in either one, there was either incarceration or pending charges at work. And then they were single mother homes, and each of them had a potential informal support in the form of a grandmother that was in the picture. With few exceptions, people identified a similar set of concerns or areas for further investigating when we presented the case study. And then we would ask things like, what are your concerns? Where would you go next? All of those kinds of next steps questions based on what they were initially presented with. So with advanced counties, in-home is almost always an option. So the almost is there since just in recognition that there will be cases where it's just not possible and it's just not feasible to keep children at home, and people recognize that. But in those advanced counties, it's almost always an option, save for the most egregious cases, at least initially. In the same way that they're very open-minded towards the family's capacity for change, they're also open-minded with respect to the nature of the safety concerns themselves and the feasibility of keeping a given case in home. So even with a complex case that involved, like I said, substance abuse, mental health, incarceration, these different things, workers approach a new case with optimism. They're open-minded about the severity of the concerns. So saying things like, what we're presented with here looks significant, but we could get there and find out that there actually aren't any safety concerns that we have to control for. You just never know. So just keeping an open mind about how a case might play out, and then and also being optimistic about being able to address potential challenges. So whether they were the mental health challenges, or one of the key differences in terms of an identified benefit within the case was we referenced that there was a father to some of the other children of the mother, not a biological father to the target children in question, but it was actually only advanced counties that saw that, pointed that out, or dwelled upon that as a source of, first and foremost, at the very least, a potential source of information to understand the history of the family and what they might learn. But then even a potential support to a case, even though it wasn't a biological father to the children in question. And so then workers in these counties just had confidence in their ability to maintain a family and home. When we asked about the feasibility around a case, they were much more likely to say, "Oh yeah, this seems, this looks pretty typical to the cases that we work to keep kids in home." On the comparison is more pessimism around the feasibility of keeping the family in home. There was more emphasis on the history of a given family with respect to the child welfare system, or talking about sort of, even you could put in all this effort and it might still go to TPR. And so that challenge to, rather than sort of take the case as it is, think about what's the feasibility or likelihood that it's going to be able to be maintained in home in the end. And there was a little bit quicker to doubt the feasibility of, say, an informal support like a grandma to be able to support a given case. When we think about next steps and how they approach gathering information that comes next, workers in advanced counties go deep in their search for understanding, and they think really broadly in terms of who might support a case in terms of either information and insight, or more direct support to the family and to the case plan. So, for example, drug use isn't the problem per se, but it's the level of dependence, the reasons for use, whether or not there's evidence of protective capacity, how that is interrelated with things like mental health or past histories of trauma. Just really wanting to know and be able to isolate ultimately, which I'll talk about next, but really wanting to know at a deep level, what are the different details, what are the different needs, how is all of this playing out, so that we can better understand and control for the concerns with respect to a given family. They also searched widely for networks of individuals who, like I said, could either provide insight or informal support. So those non-resident, non-biological fathers for specific children was a good example of being able to highlight that as a potential key source of support within the case details that we had presented. For counties that likely don't have as much exposure to carrying out in-home plans or doing in-home plans with the complexities in question, there was more of a struggle to articulate how a given detail could play out going forward. So how it would matter with respect to what the drug use looked like. So there were a few more sort of categorical assignments of, if it's meth, it's probably this. If it's marijuana, these would be my concerns. So sort of focusing more on drug type versus how that's playing out in a day-to-day or hour-by-hour sort of situation. And they tended to be a little bit more narrow in who they would go to for information, for support. So it tended to focus primarily on sort of mom and grandma, as opposed to thinking through an even broader network of support and insight that they might be able to draw on. So ultimately, this approach of really finding ways to understand at a deep level where this family is coming from, what's going on within this household, was all in a pursuit of isolating and controlling for safety. So they want to be able to really pinpoint when those safety threats are occurring and when they need to be implementing controls with respect to a given family. And they also sort of, because this is frequently done and it's a very challenging process, they also articulated a desire to further expand their skills with respect to isolating and controlling for safety. So conversations frequently revolved around the distinction between safety and risk, resulting in kind of next steps and isolated safety concerns. There was always the search for sort of the deeper backstory of what's going on within a family in order to better understand and implement those sufficient controls. The comparison then was there was more of a struggle to articulate when there might be precise safety concerns or safety threats happening within a family. And we heard a lot more about 24/7 monitoring from sort of counties that are on the way towards this progress, as opposed to we heard very little about 24/7 monitoring from within advanced counties themselves. And so the approach is really one of trying to minimize that unpredictability and have a good and confident handle on when those safety threats might be occurring, even within these high risk, potentially high risk environments. So workers then recognize that they can always improve in their practice regarding these topics. So workers were constantly working to find these safety thresholds, like I mentioned, and to determine what's feasible in home, how can we be creative, when can we not be creative. And when asked about, what kind of guidance or support or training would be helpful, we frequently heard that they wanted more training, more safety training, more decision-making training to do this effectively. They consider these complex scenarios as normal, but they're always looking, like I said, for creative ways that they can rely on their safety training to know when and where they can do that. And across all roles, actually, there was a desire for more safety training. In contrast, the comparison was that counties felt that actually the training is sufficient, the safety standards are clear, and it's really more of the resource question that is the barrier to carrying this out. So there was a very different emphasis in terms of the importance of training, further development, and sort of a sense that, no, I'm pretty clear on what the safety standards are and what they necessitate, but I just don't have the resources to do it. That was more of the comparison that we heard across our two groups. So if we think about sort of summarizing this section, we started talking about family first agency culture. So things are underway. Leaders have started to be proactive around implementation, and that culture is really reinforced through messaging from the top down. It's encouraging change-ready families as workers are open-minded and optimistic, and they really see themselves as drivers of success in respect to the quality of that worker relationship or worker-family relationship. And then in decision-making itself, they are very focused on safety. So they want to understand really deeply what is happening within this family, when are those safety threats occurring. Everything is in pursuit of being able to isolate and control for those concerns, since they know that 24/7 monitoring is so difficult to set up and achieve. So then if we think about what are the support structures further enabling this work to be carried out, I just wanted to start by talking about the external environment. So first, all counties expressed a level of shortage in their service network and acknowledged the AODA cases were their most challenging case type. That really wasn't something that differentiated sort of those advanced and on the way, those two groups that we looked at. All counties felt like those were definitely the most challenging, and everyone had things that they would like to see differently about their service network. The three most cited service barriers were around housing, transportation, and daycare. So we heard very frequently about the challenges that these present with respect to carrying out, to serving families in home. We also heard that informal supports are always going to be a key part of any plan, including their level of buy-in and support for the family. There were relatively few differences with respect to those two groups, with respect to how frequently a given service was mentioned as available. So it wasn't that in one group or another we heard like therapy is always available, or AODA assessment or treatment is always available. Sort of we heard from a variety of places these different kinds of services being available or not, with respect to serving families in home. In terms of then how different counties approached these challenges or these service network questions, there was creativity in funding allocation and the types of supports that enabled success. So directors talked more about being experienced and being creative and flexible with their funding. Workers cited sort of creative solutions to their lack of resources. So hearing things like rationalizing funding decisions in light of the imbalance between out-of-home care and current in-home spending, being comfortable justifying those creative funding uses to stakeholders, and then workers looking for ways to materially support either the basic needs or the informal supports involved in the plan. This could be, there were other things like in regards to transportation, establishing a volunteer network that could help with transportation questions, particularly in those rural areas, more rural counties where there's a lot of driving, and there's a lot of distance to travel for these different services or supports. Hiring either part-time staff or full-time staff, either to reduce the overall workload capacity or to support sort of key admin or administrative areas that could reduce some of that workload burden and enable some of this work. There wasn't necessarily a clear pattern in terms of where money was pulled from in terms of reallocating. So that is an opportunity for probably best practice sharing at the county level, just because there wasn't necessarily a one key area to pull from, but there was just more articulation of having looked at budgets, having determined kind of where can we start to adjust these resources. In terms of the kinds of services that were viewed as impactful, workers in advanced counties preferred readily available in-home services that could support the whole family. So we heard about things, we heard about more of those kind of wraparound services that could be provided in home. These services serve multiple functions. They create extra eyes on the family. They reduce barriers like transportation, and they take that approach to supporting the whole family as opposed to more of the individualized approach when possible. And like I said, workers were somewhat more likely to mention the service array as having something along these lines with respect to advanced counties. And for the comparison group, it was the focus of services was a little bit more on the safety controls being useful. So whether it was for AODA assessments or having things like alcohol monitoring, GPS monitors, things like that. There was a little bit more emphasis on those safety control services as opposed to in-home services. And there was a little bit higher mentioning of wait lists and challenges with wait lists in terms of the comparison group here, the on-the-way counties. When we think about the external stakeholders that are part of this picture, they were not viewed as a barrier to overcome when keeping children in home. So there was recognition that they can influence a given case, they can take up time, they can, certainly they play an important part, but it wasn't really where directors, supervisors, workers, it wasn't necessarily who they thought was going to influence the success of serving a family in home. So they also advanced counties showed some evidence of a stronger relationship with community partners, especially law enforcement. So having a positive relationship with a sheriff or a deputy who could support in terms of information or insight, even obviously can't always share everything, but using their partners in law enforcement to gain insight into a case or into a family or into the timeline of a case and what might be next steps with respect to the parents. Having at least one judge that was an ally. So sort of everyone articulated judges can be unpredictable. They rotate through the bench. You never know exactly where they're going to lean. But in advanced counties, there tended to be at least one judge who they felt like was an ally and in support of this kind of approach. And there, as far as community responders, that they tended to see the workers' role as going beyond child removal. So articulating a level of sort of respect and understanding for what the social workers, the caseworkers' role is, and sort of being able to partner to some extent on those different cases. Overall, there was variation across counties in terms of the level of support or buy-in from court parties or the court system. So here, when I'm saying court parties, I'm thinking of not just judges, but also whether it was, a DA or a corporation counsel that that represented the workers, or the GALs, whether they were seen as more or less supportive of this kind of shift. So multiple court parties that might be relevant to how a given case is carried out. Just to mention the comparison, then, instead of seeing these external stakeholders as sort of like part of the picture, but not necessarily the key, we heard a lot about the court system and the court system as a barrier to success for those on the way counties. So like I said, there wasn't variation in sort of where whether court was really unpredictable or whether they leaned one way or the other, but there was more emphasis on those external stakeholders as being a true barrier to the process. Higher frequency of court challenges, lack of alignment between legal parties and what the workers were trying to recommend or achieve with a given case. When we think about the state and the relationship between counties and then the state level, leaders were really looking to the state to facilitate best practice sharing with other counties and to provide overall training support. Those were the two most common things we heard. They want the state to facilitate part of that best practice sharing and to also communicate backing in terms of kind of formalizing policy rationale, statutes, standards, those kinds of things that leaders can then take and point to with their external stakeholders or other important actors to sort of show that this is a statewide important priority that is happening and that is influencing how child welfare is carried out. They also viewed enhanced safety training as a key support. So I mentioned previously that sort of workers recognize the need for more training, and this even extended up to the director level, talking more about wanting more safety training and more support in that area to help workers make these very complicated and challenging decisions. So those were sort of the two components of the external support structures that differentiated our two groups. First was that service array, recognizing that while there are shortages in the service network for all counties to some degree, there was also evidence of creativity and working to develop some of those in-home services in those advanced counties. And then for external stakeholders, seeing them as part of the picture, but not necessarily the defining feature of whether or not it was going to be, the shift would be successful or not. So then to get to the internal piece of things, so what's going on within the agency, leaders focused on what they can control. So when we asked, what will stand in the way, who will be most influential in the success of this shift, we heard a lot about their own people, so workers, supervisors, as being critical to the success of the shift, and seeking to generate buy-in at all levels. So they want the state to, they want to see that there are, that those workers feel that they are bought in, that they have a key support, and they want the state to back those decisions. But ultimately, they're very concerned with what's going on within the agency. It was a little more common to view, like I said, those external stakeholders as key to success in these counties. For leaders also understood the importance of reducing workload and working with service providers to enable success. So leaders were focused on removing those barriers for their staff, and they were working with service providers either to help improve the quality of a given service, or try and negotiate contracts that were more flexible, more comprehensive, or in some cases more refined, so that it wasn't, a given service provider wasn't necessarily a catch-all for everything, but that they had service providers that could be sort of focused on what they can do best, in order to support the variety of service needs within, with respect to serving families in home. But directors really saw their biggest challenge as being staff related: too little time, turnover in caseloads, desiring more resources, and had started to make efforts to see how they could remove some of those barriers. And then agencies having already taken steps to hire, establish volunteers, those kinds of things, in order to reduce some of those workload concerns. In comparison, there was, like I said, sort of emphasis on those external challenges or barriers, and just a little bit less progress or less awareness in terms of what some of those needs might be at the worker level, and actions that could be taken to start to reduce some of those needs. So as we get down a few more levels, supervisors really used a team environment to enable workers to gain critical learning and collaborate on time-intensive case plans. So supervisors, they really use their time with their teams as times for collaboration and kind of shared learning. They took much more of a backseat role in the conversations with their team meetings, and they were much more sort of facilitators as opposed to directors of any conversation. They rarely gave really sort of firm guidance or recommendation. It was a lot more of supporting workers and thinking through the different elements of the case, what questions might need to be asked next. But there was a lot of space for workers themselves to kind of share insight, share thoughts, collaborate with one another in terms of the decisions that somebody might be dealing with at the time. Meetings were less structured. They sort of had an overall structure, but then there was a lot of just more free-flowing conversation in terms of what was most critical for the team members on the calls. And individual staffings were still common, but team meetings were probably prioritized. They were prioritized over even individual staffing. So in some cases, whether or not there was a weekly individual staffing or a biweekly individual staffing depended on the level of experience of a given worker, or what else might be going on that week. But those team meetings tended to be a priority. The team environment then, not just meetings, but extending out of those meetings, supported decision making and workloads. So we sort of started this talking about the agency culture being a family first culture that really reinforces the importance of doing in-home work. And that helps hold workers accountable to pursuing in-home plans and seeing whether or not it's feasible to serve a family in home. And then that team dynamic really supports the worker in terms of being able to, they talked about, calling each other frequently inside and outside of meetings. They talked about relying on more senior workers quite a bit. It wasn't just a supervisor that they would go to for support, but their coworkers played a really key role. They talked about, because there can be urgent needs that come up with in-home cases. You might need to change around a plan quite a few times. And in order to make that possible, they talked about more workload sharing. So because there's more of a collaborative environment, someone might have to address a particular need of a family on a given day, and another worker can help to take some of the admin or other work that was on their plate that they had planned to do that day. They might offload that to another worker so that they can kind of shift and pivot as needed with respect to whatever the case needs were for that day. In comparison, the comparison here is that workers tended to talk about more sort of relying on gut feelings, or whether they felt like in-home decisions would or wouldn't be supported with respect to what a case looked like. Individual staffings were emphasized over sort of team collaboration, and there was a little bit more focus on not really knowing when a supervisor or a leader might support an in-home plan. So just greater inconsistency in terms of some of those decisions. Across the board, workers said that in-home planning is easiest when there's alignment on the plan in terms of the case team, learning from coworkers, there's a clear understanding of guidelines, and there's the existence of informal supports. So kind of everyone said that when we can achieve those things, carrying out this work is easiest or is best supported. So then ultimately at the end of the day, everyone collectively manages the risk and responsibility of in-home decisions. So nothing falls solely on the worker. Workers and supervisors felt backed by their next level leaders when it came to their case decisions because of that team environment, because of that agency culture. There was a sense that I am not alone in making these decisions. The risk is not fully on me based on how this case plays out. And leaders are concerned with making sure their workers feel this way, that they feel backed in their decision making. Because of those collective, like I said, team decisions, that's really helpful in making sure people feel supported in their decision making. It also allows workers to be creative and take risks because they know they have collaborated, they know they've run their ideas by people, they know that there's a level of support there in terms of trying new things and getting creative with a case. When that wasn't the case, when that kind of environment didn't exist, workers talked more about, like I said, that inconsistency in supervisors, sort of having experiences where they spent a lot of time developing an in-home plan and then it wasn't supported. And after having that experience once or twice, having it be very discouraging in terms of continuing to spend that level of effort to do that plan without knowing whether or not it was going to get buy-in or support from a given supervisor or a given leader. And they talked about the being more fearful or uncomfortable with managing the risk associated, balancing that distinction between kind of risk and safety within a given family, and being finding that to be a really difficult piece of carrying out in-home plans. So mentioning not as much evidence that they felt sort of fully backed by in the decisions that they're making. So in terms of outcomes, we sort of started at the top. We had proactive leaders focusing internally and on developing that service provider network, understanding the implications of a shift. We had effective teams as critical means of training and collaboration and helping to manage some of those workload burdens, and supported workers who know that they are backed and supported by an agency culture, by their next level leaders, and by sort of team decision making in the decisions they're making with respect to a given case. So that's sort of our final part of the findings. I wanted to also call attention to within these tables you see on the right side there, you see directors, supervisors, and workers as key actors. So some of these behaviors are particularly relevant to leaders. Some of them are more or less relevant to supervisors. Some are relevant to all, as you can see there on that last one. But that's just as we will pass along these materials after the presentation, and that's to help people start to think about targeting or prioritizing kind of where some of these behaviors might be reinforced and who they might be reinforced with or by whom. The last thing that I'll just mention, which it wasn't necessarily a differentiating behavior, but it was an important topic that we wanted to explore with respect to this research. So we asked about racial disparities and disparities in care. So we know in terms of national and state level data that there are disparities in the child welfare system, in those who enter out of home care. And some of the disparities that were talked about when we asked at the county level were due to sort of individual unconscious biases. Others highlighted were more around policy and procedure or systemic barriers. So when we asked about the kind of level of importance of the question of disparities in child welfare or disparities in out-of-home care specifically, in general, people said this was really important. It varied by geography and region, so not so much our kind of key comparison group, but more in terms of where counties were within within the state of Wisconsin. Some felt it was sort of a less relevant conversation in the sense that there either wasn't awareness that disparities existed, or it was just harder to think about what disparities would manifest themselves the most, particularly if there was less racial diversity within a given county. In the absence of racial diversity, it was typically economic disparities that were highlighted. And then how this played out in decision making, it starts from the beginning potentially in terms of who might be screened in, certainly on who is reported to hotlines to begin with. Some counties had started to focus on workforce and service provider diversity, acknowledging that this could help better engage families and better connect with families. A need for training staff on sort of cultural awareness for how to have effective conversations with families that might be different from them, and then the question of addressing criminal histories and how this can often disqualify in many cases given informal support. So there wasn't necessarily a clear differentiating approach to how to address that, but there was discussion even in those case scenarios of looking at the criminal history, but then also trying to understand a little bit more about, when did that criminal offense happen? What has been the history since then? To what extent should this influence any decisions about someone's involvement in a given case? But that was one of the more structural barriers that people could fairly readily point to in terms of some of the systemic challenges that relate to being able to serve families in home. So that's really the full set of findings that we have for you. I can talk about next steps as well in terms of what comes next, but I just wanted to pause there and see if there are any questions, reactions, anything that feels important or that you wanted to call out before I talk about kind of the timeline for next steps.
Somebody's got to have one comment. So what are some of your reactions? What do people think? Still absorbing? Still thinking?
I think that having gone through the process as a director, I think it's really impressive that that information was all synthesized, that all resonates as true to me. And, I can see areas where we are farther along than in some of the other areas. But when I step back and think about the interview process and then sort of what's made us be successful, where we're able to have success, I think, yeah, I'm very impressed with sort of what seems to be the accuracy of that.
There were a couple things that stood out to me. One, I'm sitting here, as an agency going, boy, I really want to know what's specific to us. And I don't know if that's something that will ever come out. But I think, anything that we can use to grow and develop as an agency to make things look better or different. And then the other thing that had me doing like a little bit of cartwheels in my head is some of the data to support supervisory workforce moving from answering and directing to really some of that other stuff. I know through supervising safety, there's been lots of work done specific to supervisory questions. And I know with other supervisor trainings and all of that stuff, it's just sometimes when you see things go on for so long and then you see it kind of come to fruition, it's like, yes, finally, I love that this is actually happening. So that was really cool to see.
All right. Well, while we're all thinking of our other questions or areas that we might want to clarify, I can talk a little bit about next steps, if that makes sense, kind of what's coming next. So we are, we've, done a lot of research to arrive to this point. And now it's really about creating a learning experience for workers and supervisors to further reinforce and understand the change that's happening sort of across the state, engage workers and supervisors in this change. And so we do that through learning maps is one of the modalities that we use. Like I said, these are large visual dialogue-based experiences that help us think about the change journey, think about our role in the change, and what we want to see going forward. There's also film involved in that process to help tell that story. We'll be developing that over the next few months, leading into July is when we'll hope to roll out that those materials. And then also in conjunction with the learning map and film is what we call Compass. It's a manager development program that will be used to support managers in some of these. Some of them are sort of foundational manager skills that can be helpful in better working with teams, better leading our people. And then some of it will be more tailored specifically to the type of work that you all are doing. And then we'll also have on the back end of that process a little bit further research to understand where we at after we've done these variety of activities. Where are we at? How are people feeling? What might be areas that we need to prioritize for further support and reinforcement based on sort of current understanding and current barriers and supports that have gone on. So those are some of the activities that we have coming next. Yeah, feel free to, like I said, Rachel Heidloff is the one who will be leading that next phase of work out on the root side. She's the one leading that next phase of work. So really starting to bring this to life, not just with the counties that participated, but also across the state, kind of thinking about solutions as well.
Hey, John, what did you guys think?
So we were very impressed with the results and can see how this definitely can be useful. Obviously, I think it verifies we're a county-run system when we know we have 72 different cultures, right? And I think this approach that we're taking is really trying to take the system approach, but know that it's going to stick different and work different in each county. But what we're trying to do is help provide a framework and through these tools and everything that we can all use. But we know it's going to manifest itself, I think, a little bit different in each county. Just because there's different leadership, there's different cultures. But I think this framework, when we get to these implementations, these learning maps will really kind of help. And it's going to kind of grow within your own community and how it works within your own county. And one of the other things that we're starting to talk about too, sorry, my dogs are barking. One of the other things that we've been talking about too is how do we help arm you guys with some engagement strategies and things that you can use with your community providers. So law enforcement, legal, schools, your county boards and things like that. So we'll be more to come on that piece too, because we know that's an important piece that you guys really need to help within your own kind of systems and your own community partners. And then what can we do, what we can do on the system level. So working with the Children's Court Improvement Project, working with some of those system-wide partners, we can try to do some of that kind of help also.
This is Wendy. I think that one of the other things that I really appreciate about this project and about all of the time that was put in on all of the different sides, right? Root put in a tremendous amount of time, and all of you giving up your time and allowing people to, shadow you and all the interviews and everything. It's that I feel like we got such a more nuanced look at these different pieces. And so the thing that keeps on, impressing me about this is the subtleties of the difference between the sort of the groups that are almost there and the groups that are more in that advanced area. And so like the idea that, that the groups that have gotten to that sort of more advanced stage here are saying that they are hungry for additional training because they've gotten to that point where there's very nuanced pieces to keeping kids and families at home, and they're sort of over that initial hurdle. And then for some of the other people saying, no, I think we have enough training, this and the standards are clear, and I think we know what we need to do. And some of those very, very small subtleties, I think, are actually what's going to help us as we think as a system about how do we move forward. And so, to answer your question, I'm very, very excited about this research because I think it gives us such a look into the diversity of ways that that people are approaching and tackling this issue, and really gets to the heart of some of those values and different pieces that we really need to think about as a system to move forward. So, very excited about this work.
Great. Any other questions, reactions? Like we said, Sarah will send this out to you guys. And then we'll be working on a broader kind of communication plan to get this information out to your colleagues in the other counties. But any other questions or reactions?
John, this is Katie. You just mentioned plan for getting this information out to the other counties as well. So when this information is shared, does that stay within this cohort at this time?
So no. So our plan would be to get this this presentation, either the recording of this presentation and the actual presentation out to all counties. Giving some context of what it is. I mean, obviously the Wixom PAC has been involved in this, but other counties probably are not aware of this project. So bringing some awareness overall to the project and then bringing awareness to the results and kind of the next steps to everybody.
Great, thanks.
I just want to say thank you. This is a really practical product from my perspective. Just to be able to, it will really help us translate some of what you learned into practical strategies and a practical way to talk about it and think about it. So thanks.
I'm excited to make some changes and some opportunities for education at a statewide level as well. It's easier on a county level if the whole state is doing something different and there's a big initiative. It feels like there's a larger cohort than just sort of freestyling it within your own county. And so I'm excited for some statewide system change and new directives. And from the county perspective, we would be leaning pretty hard on the state to help provide that curriculum and some of the tools we need.
Great. Yep. And I think that's a great point, Kevin. And, I think part of the reason why we're excited about this project is, as you guys know, from a state perspective, when we take on some big, and this is probably one of the bigger initiatives that we've ever done, partnering with you guys to really transform our system. And we've had some bigger changes in the past, but this is a pretty significant one. And I think we knew when we set out on this is like, you guys are going to make or break this, right? It's going to happen at your level. It's going to happen with the supervisors and your workers. They are the ones that are the boots on the ground that are really interacting with those families. So we want to be able to provide kind of this framework and help so we can make this change. So typically, if we were making a change, maybe even a smaller change, we would just send out like the numbered memo, right? Okay, here's what you need to do. Here's the process that we're going to go through. But we know this is a pretty significant shift in our system, and that there's going to be a variety of kind of opinions, attitudes, and behaviors related to this. So we want to make sure that we're giving you guys kind of that framework and the tools and really can engage your staff in these conversations so that they can really talk about it, because this is a big change, and taking on some of that additional risk is going to be hard for some to make that change. So we're hoping that, I think this will be a great way to be able to do that, engage your staff as we move forward.
Because Katie's on the call, it just makes me think about how, from a director standpoint, we might be able to use Wixa to have some of the conversations. Because I think about some of my colleagues around the state that have some, have varying levels of obstacles to making these kinds of changes. Community culture, outside contributors like boards and things like that. And I think to think about how we have the conversation at that level, because honestly, everybody has to know that somebody's got their back in order for this stuff to work. And so I think it might be I think it'd be a great conversation to have about how we might be able to utilize Wixa to help with that.
Thanks for that, Chris. Absolutely.
The exciting thing about system and practice change is that it's not just one more mandate, okay? Not just one more thing, because that's what staff shudder at and management shudders at, is some more mandates, some more paperwork, some more screens. What do you mean I have to do this and this and this? It's with some of the things that we've done in the state, it's about doing things differently and better versus more, if that makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. All right. Any other last minute comments or reactions?
I was just gonna say thank you. Also, this document is, I was thinking about it as almost like it's a primer of that, what did you call it, Jen? Foundation, outlining how to think about moving forward. And this begins to be a tool to help us with our conversations internally, but to highlight kind of what Chris was saying, that to be able to continue to work towards developing talking points or tools to help this changed, holy cow. To help us with those conversations with our partners will be absolutely critical and essential. And so this really feels like just the start. We've got a lot of incredible information here to really dig into.
Agree. All right. So again, I want to thank you guys for your participation in this and your staff's participation, because I know it was a lot of work and effort, and we really, really appreciate that. And I think that's going to pay off as we kind of move forward. I also forgot at the beginning to thank Casey Family Programs, because they partnered with us on this and actually funded this first part. So they funded the research part with them. So I really appreciate them. And I think they see the value in this kind of on a broader scale and see how other child welfare agencies can do things like this. So I really appreciate their involvement in this as we go forward. So they're going to continue to be involved too as we look at that. So, and then I want to thank Root as our partner in this. I think they did a fantastic job and really kind of got in there. I think impressed with their understanding of our system so quickly and our strategy and the things that we're moving forward. So they really took it to heart and did a lot of their own kind of learning on that process. So I think that was really helpful too, to have partners that spent that time and dedication to really kind of learn what we're doing and learn about you. So with that, if there's not any other questions, obviously there's a lot more to come. We'll keep you informed. We'll talk about how we, kind of roll this out larger to other counties as we move forward. But again, thank you, and everybody have a great weekend. I think spring is finally here, hopefully, and we'll stay here in Wisconsin. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.